Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So we'd like to, welcome Jonathan, who's going to be speaking about password-based key exchange. So Vinod is a member of the crypto group, and I guess Vinod graduated from MIT and did a postdoc at IBM Watson. So also I guess I should mention that we're planning on having these crypto colloquiums weekly. So the regular time will be Thursdays at 1:30. So if you're interested, we hope you'll be able to attend.
Thanks, Sunny. Okay, so this talk is on password-based key exchange at the cost of Diffie-Hellman. This is joint work with Jonathan Katz at University of Maryland. Key exchange is a very basic, very fundamental primitive in cryptography. This was defined by Diffie and Hellman in the 1970s in a work that really started off modern cryptography. And what they did was they defined this notion and they constructed a very beautiful, very simple protocol that achieves key exchange. What it does is it lets two parties, Alice and Bob in this picture, who have never met before in life, come together, exchange messages on a public communication channel, and still agree on a shared secret key. This is a really magical primitive, and it's a very simple protocol to achieve this primitive. Okay, so this protocol is fast. It's blazingly fast. Each party sends one message, and these messages are sent simultaneously, in the sense that Alice doesn't have to wait to hear Bob's message before she sends her own, and the same for Bob. And yeah, this is really a super fast protocol. The protocol is succinct. By that I mean that it has small communication complexity. Each party exchanges one group element. That's that. And we believe that this protocol is actually secure under what we now call the decisional Diffie-Hellman assumption. Okay, so this seems great. Seems like the perfect world, except for one little problem, which is that the security of this protocol holds only against passive eavesdropping adversaries, namely adversaries who can listen in on the communication channel between Alice and Bob and do nothing else. They can listen in, they can gather a whole bunch of messages and then try to analyze the shared key. Okay. Another way of looking at the Diffie-Hellman protocol is a way to start off from an authenticated channel where Alice and Bob know who they're talking to, and bootstrap on top of it a secure private communication channel. Okay. Okay, so that's great. But what we would really like is to come up with a protocol which shares all these nice features, and on top of that achieves security against active adversaries. By active adversaries, I mean adversaries that can sort of sit in the middle of the communication channel. They can modify, insert, delete messages, do whatever they want. Okay? In other words, what we want to do is we want to start off from scratch and construct an authenticated and secure channel on top of it. Okay? This is what we want to do in an ideal world. Okay? This setting, it turns out, is a very challenging setting. So, for example, one thing that the active adversary can do is it can cut off the communication channel between Alice and Bob. Okay? There's nothing that you can do to prevent this kind of an attack, sort of a denial of service attack. But what is more serious is a kind of impersonation attack that the active adversary can mount. Namely, the adversary can sit in the middle. It can talk to Alice pretending that it's Bob, and it can talk to Bob pretending that it's Alice. Now, Alice has nothing to tell between the adversary, whether she's talking to an adversary or Bob. So she will happily communicate with the adversary, agree on a shared key, and then start encrypting all her data using this shared key. Essentially what she is doing is she is giving away all her data to the adversary for free. Okay, this is really extremely serious and exposes all the private information of Alice. Something we would like to prevent. Okay, so if you look at this attack, a little more closely, you can see that the main problem here is that Alice has no way to distinguish between the adversary on one hand and Bob on the other. Okay? In other words, Alice and Bob don't share any information a priori to let Alice distinguish between these two entities. Turning this around, if we want to solve the impersonation attack problem, and we really do, we need to let Alice and Bob share some information, sort of common a priori setup information. Okay? In fact, there have been, so in other words, what we are solving is not the problem that we started off with, namely how to get a secure authenticated channel from scratch. We are really only going to be able to solve the problem of getting a secure authenticated channel from a minimal sort of setup assumption, from a less strong setup assumption. Okay, so people have looked at a bunch of these setup assumptions in the literature. The most common are sort of assuming that there is a public infrastructure, which means that Alice has a public key for which she knows the secret key, and this public key is up in the sky. Everyone can see it, including Bob, and so does Bob, right? So this is one setting that people have looked at. In fact, there has been a whole bunch of work in this setting, including some very recent work by folks here at Microsoft Research, including Brian Lamacchia and Aaron Kristen. And what these works focus on, so this setting is in principle very easy to handle. Because there is a public infrastructure up in the sky, I could just run the Diffie-Hellman protocol and sign all the messages on top of it, right? So that should, in principle, solve the problem of impersonation attack. But what people were focusing on in this line of work is, number one, to optimize the efficiency of the resulting protocol. So, I want to sort of minimize the extra information that I add on top of Diffie-Hellman and still get authentication on top of it. And number two, how to handle stronger classes of attacks. For example, forward security is something that Kristen worked on quite a lot. And this is one setting that people have considered. We are not going to. This is not the setting that we will work with today. A second setting is one where Alice and Bob share a high entropy shared key. So this is not a uniformly random key. If it were, it would be already useful. You could already use it as a shared key. It has some, it is a long string which has some entropy. I just don't know where the entropy is, so I can't use it directly in a cryptographic protocol. Instead, what I want to do is to refine this high entropy key to a uniformly random key, which I can then use in a cryptographic protocol. Okay, so this is the goal of this setting. Again, this is not what we will talk about today. What we will talk about today is the setting of password-based authenticated key exchange, where the two parties, Alice and Bob, share a password or a low entropy shared string. So think of a password as an ATM pin, 4 digits, or a computer logon password. Right? Now, again, their goal is the same. They share a short password, and they want to bootstrap it to a cryptographically strong key. The challenging thing about this setting is that the password is so short, so little entropy, that you can't use it directly in a cryptographic protocol. Instead, you have to sort of do something non-trivial on top of it to get a high entropy string. And this is in contrast to both these other settings where you can think of the shared information as having already high entropy. Okay, so in principle, this setting is more challenging than both the other settings that people have considered. And in fact, people, even in practice, people use passwords all the time. And a common attack against these systems is a dictionary attack, namely one that enumerates these passwords, so it does something a little more clever, but essentially a dictionary attack. And what we would like to do is we would like to add cryptographic protection on top of password-based systems to make them harder to make it harder to mount dictionary attacks. And this you will see in just a little bit. Okay, so this is the setting that we will talk about. And let's look at this setting a little bit more closely. Okay, so again, Alice and Bob share a password, which is chosen from a small dictionary. And one thing that you can already observe in this setting is that you cannot prevent online password guessing attacks. what I mean by this is that the adversary can start a whole bunch of sessions, key exchange sessions between Alice and Bob. In each session, the adversary sits in the middle. It guesses 2 passwords, one for the interaction with Alice and one for the interaction with Bob. And it does it for all the Q sessions. Okay? So what is the chance that one of these guesses is correct? It is 2 times the number of sessions, 2 times Q, divided by the dictionary size. And what this means is that with this probability, the adversary can actually successfully impersonate Alice or Bob, one of the 2 guys, and agree on a shared key with one of the 2 parties. Okay, so Yuval?
Yes. I mean, since they really share the same password,
yes.
How can the adversary get by with having 2 different passwords on both sides of the talk? That might be detectable.
No, what the adversary does is a priori doesn't know what the password is. It has no information.
But you know the
so then it says, let me enumerate, right? Let me enumerate 1, 2, 3, and 1 I'm going to sort of use in the first session with Alice. I succeed or I don't succeed. Okay, if I don't succeed, tough luck. I close that session. If I do, then that's great for me.
So you're not man in the middle. You're just doing a session either with Alice or with Bob.
It is a man in the middle. I sit in the middle and I talk to Alice and I talk to Bob. Okay. So it is a sort of an impersonation. It is an impersonation
It's
attack.
just a factor of 2 that puzzle. If I try to cheat, I would use the same password to cheat Alice and Bob, and either I succeed.
Well, a better thing to do is to use different passwords. That way you get 2 password guesses in each session, right? So this is something that the adversary can do. There is no way you can prevent this attack. But what makes this problem interesting and non-trivial is that online attacks are usually hard to carry out, and they're usually easy to detect. So there could be a system outside this setting to detect or prevent or minimize the damage of online attacks. And what we would like to do in this problem is we would like to offer optimal protection against offline attacks. So if the adversary is restricted to doing offline attacks, there is absolutely nothing he can do. Plus, we would like to offer the best possible protection that we can against online attacks. By best possible protection, I mean that the only thing the adversary can do is do this password guessing business. He can succeed with probability 2 times the number of sessions divided by the dictionary size, and that's that. That's the best he can do. Okay? So we already saw that this kind of attack cannot be prevented, and so this really gives you a very tight guarantee. Okay, questions? Okay, so let me be a little bit more formal. This is not very important, but what the security definition says is that the adversary can start many different sessions, let's say Q sessions. In each session, it can guess the password with either of the 2 entities. And eventually, it starts a test session between Alice and Bob, and it shouldn't be able to guess what the key in the test session is, except with probability this number, which is inevitable in any way. Right? So this really captures what we needed, which is that we offer the best possible protection against online attacks. Yeah, Alice.
Requirement that, for example, Alice can tell if the adversary is using the password if the session fails, basically?
Yes. So I'm not going to talk about. So this sort of stronger definition is called mutual authentication, which means that if a session fails, if the adversary gets the wrong password, Alice and Bob can both tell. You can achieve in all the protocols that I present, you can achieve mutual authentication at the cost of 1 extra message. And that is actually necessary. I mean, you can't avoid. So what I'm talking about, you can't get if you need mutual authentication. You can't get 1 round with mutual authentication. But I'm not going to talk about that any further. Okay. So this is the definition that we would like to achieve. And in fact, there has been a lot of work on password-based key exchange. The early work in this problem was in the ideal cipher or the random oracle model, where we can actually construct very efficient solutions. In particular, you can construct a 1-round protocol, same as Diffie-Hellman, with very low communication complexity. Okay? But the point is that random oracles don't exist. You cannot assume that SHA is a random oracle. And thus, people started looking at sort of the problem of getting rid of random oracles. In particular, the work on what's called the common random string model, which says that there is a sort of a random string up in the sky that everyone can see, and including the parties and the adversary, and that's that. Assuming this setup assumption, can we get key exchange? And in this model, the best known solutions need at least 3 rounds of back and forth communication. Okay. People have looked at sort of removing even this setup assumption, even removing the common random string in the sky, but what's called the plain model, which is a very challenging setting. And the solutions in this model tend to be very inefficient. In particular, it's far, far away from what you can get by Diffie-Hellman. We will also look at the problem of guaranteeing a very strong notion of security called universal composability. It's called UC security, which guarantees, you don't need to know what universal composability is, but the only thing that you need to know is that it automatically guarantees concurrent composition of protocols. So if the adversary can manage to run many of these key exchange sessions in an interleaved way, it still offers security. If you prove that the protocol is universally composable, you can tolerate arbitrarily correlated password distribution. So you don't need to assume that the password distribution is random or any sort of fixed distribution. It automatically tolerates any password distribution, and so on and so forth. Lots of goodies that you can get by proving universal composability. In fact, that's what we'll do. This setting is even more challenging than all the other settings that I talked about. In fact, the known solutions, even assuming a random oracle, need at least 5 or 6 rounds of communication, depending on which setting you're talking about. So the question we ask in this work is, can I achieve password-based key exchange at really the cost of Diffie-Hellman? In other words, I want a protocol that is fast. I want a protocol that communicates as few group elements as possible, and I want it to be secure against active attacks. Okay, so this problem is theoretically well motivated, simply because key exchange is a very fundamental primitive in cryptography, and the question of what are the minimal resources that you need to achieve key exchange is a very basic question. It is also practically motivated because you may not care about sort of a 40-round solution versus a 39-round solution, but if you can achieve really sort of 1-round Diffie-Hellman-like solution, it is actually very useful in the setting of highly constrained devices, for example, sensor networks. For example, consider a sensor network where the sensors have limited state, so they can't store long strings. All they can store is short passwords. Short password-like strings, and the sensor is, it's asleep almost all of the time. It wakes up briefly, listens to broadcast message from the server, which might include one of the messages in the key exchange protocol. It does some processing, comes up with the shared key, encrypts all its data using the shared key, and sends it off. The server goes to sleep immediately. Okay, so it doesn't have the ability to store absolutely any state. And this is a setting in which a 1-round solution is really critical. Okay, so again, the question that we ask is, can I achieve password-based key exchange at really the cost of Diffie-Hellman? That's exactly what we show. We show such a protocol which is universally composable, and the protocol is round optimal, in the sense that the parties send 1 message each, and the messages can be sent simultaneously. You don't have to wait to hear the other party's message. The protocol is succinct, which means that each party communicates a constant number of group elements. And the protocol is secure under what's called the decisional linear assumption, which is really the same as the decisional Diffie-Hellman assumption in bilinear groups. Okay, so it's morally it's the same as the decisional Diffie-Hellman assumption. Okay, a couple of comments about remarks about this result. First of all, we do need to achieve this strong notion of security, namely composability. You do need some kind of trusted setup. In particular, a random string is a fairly benign form of trusted setup. All it says is that there is a random string in the sky which everyone can access. That's that. So to achieve this strong notion of security, previous work needed at least 5 or 6 rounds of communication, whereas we do it in sort of 1 round. And as I said before, achieving universal composability, the strong notion of security, gives you a whole bunch of goodies for free. Namely, the protocol is secure against concurrent executions. It's secure even if the password distributions are arbitrary, and so on and so forth. For those of you who might be wondering what this order of 1, what this constant means, it is really 42. Okay. And in fact, 42 is not optimal by any means. After I gave this talk in China last week, we've been able to improve this even further. I hesitate to give concrete numbers, but something like the 20s.
So about twice as good or half as big.
20 times as big. 20 times as big. Right? Diffie-Hellman is 1 group element each way. I'm saying about 20-ish group elements each way. So we don't solve the problem that we started with, unfortunately, but what we do solve is we construct a password-based key exchange protocol at essentially morally the same cost as Diffie-Hellman. Okay, good. So let me sort of describe how our protocol works. I'm going to describe this in a very high level without sort of going into sort of the details of and the specific details. But if you have any questions, do ask. Questions? Good. Okay. So the starting point of our protocol is a special kind of unauthenticated key exchange protocol, namely one that is secure against passive eavesdropping adversaries. Okay, and the primitives that we use here are public encryption, regular public encryption, together with what I will call smooth projective hash functions. Okay, I'll define this in just a bit. And this is a primitive that was invented by Kramer and Shoup. And what it does is the following. It is a family of functions. It's a bunch of hash functions, right? You can choose a function at random from this family, and so on and so forth. It comes bundled with what's called a projection function, which takes a key and projects it down to a smaller subspace, if you will. Okay, it projects it down to a smaller key, in some sense. What are the properties that I need from this family of functions? First, this hash function takes 2 things as input, a message and a ciphertext. Okay, it takes a ciphertext message pair as input. And we consider 2 cases. One, the ciphertext C is actually an encryption of the message. Okay, it's honest to God, good encryption of the message. In that case, this function can be computed in 2 distinct ways. The first is when it's given all the inputs, namely the key k, the hash key k, and the input, which is the message and the ciphertext. So if it's given all these things, it can compute the hash function, obviously. But the more interesting thing is that it can compute the hash function even if it's not given all of these things. Namely, if it's given only the projected key, not the actual key, and also the randomness that it used to generate the ciphertext. Okay, so this is sort of a balancing game. Either I'm given the key, in which I can compute the hash function, or I'm not given the key, but I'm given some random information about the ciphertext that lets me compute the hash function. Okay, so this is really the interesting part, and this is sort of a correctness property. It tells you when you can compute the hash function. The security property, namely something that tells you when you cannot compute the hash function, is that if the ciphertext happens to not be a valid encryption of the message, if C is not a valid encryption of M, then the value of the hash value is statistically hidden given the projection of the key. Okay? Yeah.
Under bullet 2, you also get C and M, or you don't get C and M?
You do get C and M, yes. Good question. You get C and M, but you don't get the key. If you did get the key, you can compute it yourself, but I'm only going to give you the projected key. Okay? And then you cannot compute the hash value. In fact, the hash value looks random to you. Okay? It's a very nice primitive. It looks mysterious at first, but let me give you an example to hopefully demystify it a bit. Okay, so this is an example for the case when the public key encryption is the El-Gamal encryption, which is, to encrypt a message, I compute G to the R and H to the R times the message. Okay. The key for this, for the corresponding smooth projective hash function, is a pair of elements from ZP. P is the order of the group, and the projection is G to the X times H to the Y. Okay. So the important thing to note is that the projection function takes two elements from the group ZP, X and Y, and it sort of compresses it down to one group element, namely G to the X times H to the Y. So it's a sort of a many-to-one function, and it loses information inherently. In other words, given the projected key, it is impossible to compute the actual key back. Okay. So how does the hash function work? It takes a ciphertext and a message, and it simply computes. So it simply computes the first element of the ciphertext to the power x times the second element divided by m. So that removes the m here and leaves you with h to the r to the power y. So in other words, this is exactly what happens if you compute the hash function on a valid ciphertext. Okay. So the all-important exciting property here is commutativity, which means that you can write this quantity by sort of flipping the two exponents with each other. You can write it as G to the X to the power R times H to the Y to the power R. In other words, it's the projected key to the power the randomness you use to generate the ciphertext. Okay, so you can compute the hash value in two different ways. Either you're given the ciphertext by itself, so you know this guy and this guy, but you're given the key. Or you're not given the key, you're only given the projected key, but you know the randomness used to compute the ciphertext. Okay. On the other hand, it's simple linear algebra, but let's not get into the details. If you're given neither the randomness, you're only given the ciphertext and the message, and you're not given the key, you're only given the projected key, then the hash output looks uniformly random to you. Okay? Yeah.
What is uppercase G?
Okay, good. So C is the ciphertext. It is a pair of elements, and I write it as uppercase G and uppercase H. So uppercase G is supposed to be little g to the r in the real world, and uppercase H is supposed to be h to the r times m. Okay. Melissa?
So
skeptical.
So you're not given, in the second bullet with where things statistically hidden,
Yes.
you're given C, but you're not given this, and that C actually encrypts where the randomness is?
No, you are given the ciphertext and the message.
And the real message.
And the real message.
So then if you're talking about statistical guarantees,
I am talking about so I guess.
R is 2, right?
Say that again?
If you're talking about statistical guarantees, can we assume that you know what R is 2?
No, you.
Because R is determined by the ciphertext, right? The ciphertext in the message determines the R.
Yes, you're right. So what I'm saying is that if the ciphertext is not an encryption of M, then this little g will look like g to the little r, and the h over m will look like little h to the power s for some different s, right? So the difference between sort of valid. Say that again.
You're given this R, I guess, but not the.
Even if you're given the r and s. So what I'm claiming is that even if you're given the r and s, you can't tell if you can't distinguish the hash value from random. Okay. So this is kind of a statistical guarantee, and it's really important that technically it's really important that it has the statistical guarantee. Okay. So so this is just to sort of give an example of how one goes about constructing a smooth projective hash function. But what we will use in our protocol is something, we won't use ElGamal. We will use something a little bit more sophisticated, but morally the same thing. So for that encryption, you can construct a smooth projective hash function the same way as we did here. Okay. Good. So how does the protocol work given a smooth projective hash function? Remember that Alice and Bob share a password, and there is a common random string, which is the public key for the encryption scheme. So there is a random string. No one needs to know the secret key corresponding to the random string, so it's not the PKI setting. It's just a common random string setting. Okay, so how does the protocol work? Alice encrypts her password, sends it off to Bob. Bob chooses a random hash key, k, computes the projected key alpha of k, sends it off to Alice. Okay. Now, both the parties compute the hash value applied to the ciphertext and the password, their own password. And they can do this because Alice, who knows only the projected key, knows the randomness she used to generate this ciphertext. So that's the extra information that pushes her off the edge, and she can compute the hash value. On the other hand, Bob actually knows the key. He doesn't know just the projected key. He knows the actual hash key, and he can compute the key too. So this is really, one can think of this as a generalization of the Diffie-Hellman protocol. Okay, so I just told you why the parties can compute the keys. I didn't tell you why the protocol is secure. Okay, so this protocol by itself is only going to be secure against passive adversaries, like I promised. And security really follows from the semantic security or int CPA security of the encryption scheme, which says that the ciphertext, when the adversary looks on and sees both these values, the ciphertext looks like a random string to it. So in other words, it can't distinguish the ciphertext from an encryption of junk or a random password. Okay, so from the adversary's point of view, this looks like an encryption of a random password and a projected key. And then the smoothness, so the security property of the hash proof system, says that if C were the encryption of a random password, then the hash value will look statistically random to the adversary. Okay, so combined, these two properties say that the adversary has computationally no information about the shared key. Okay, so really, if you think about it a little more deeply, what you can see that this is really the Diffie-Hellman key exchange protocol, except that it has a statistical security guarantee. The proof of security goes through kind of a statistical argument. Okay, so this is the basic sort of starting point, but unfortunately it's only secure against passive eavesdropping adversaries. Yes?
So if CRS is a public key, usually there's a private key corresponding to it.
Yes, but no one needs to know it.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the private key corresponding to the CRS will only be used in the security proof. In the real world, no one has to know it. So this is like the magic of cryptography, right? I mean,
does it have to exist?
It has to exist.
So
yes.
you have to create something random that does have a private key.
But usually you can. So think of the ElGamal encryption scheme, right? The public key is G to the X, which is a random group element, which has a secret key, right? So. Okay, so what we would like to do is we want to sort of add things on top of this sort of nice basic protocol and make it secure against active attacks, and hopefully not too many sort of things on top of it. Okay, so there are two issues with this protocol, reasons why it's not secure against active adversaries. The first is that the encryption scheme might be malleable, right? So you might be able to take the ciphertext, which is the encryption of a password, and transform it into an encryption of a related password, which you could then forward to a different session, and you could do funny things with it. Right. So, and the way we know of a very standard way to solve this problem, which is to use a non-malleable encryption scheme. Instead of using a standard CPA secure encryption scheme, use a CCA secure encryption scheme. In fact, these encryption schemes can be very efficiently constructed, so we don't pay too much in terms of cost. Okay. So what this does, what this modification does, is it makes it hard for the adversary to modify Alice's message. Okay. So it cannot impersonate Alice to Bob anymore. That's what this modification does. But what it can do is it can still impersonate Bob to Alice. Okay, so look at Bob's message. What he sends is he chooses a random hash key, he projects it and sends it over to Bob. What he sends has nothing to do with his password. Okay, so what the adversary can do is it can sit in the middle, it can talk to Alice, and what it can do is it can choose its own random hash key, project it, and send it to Bob. Send it to Alice. Okay, and that should work just as fine because this message does not depend on the password at all. How do you solve it? Well, we have a protocol with a one-sided security guarantee, namely you cannot impersonate Alice, but you can impersonate Bob. So what do? You reuse it, right? So you run two instances of this protocol, one where Alice sends the ciphertext and Bob sends the hash key, and another where the roles are reversed. Alice sends the hash key, the projected key, and Bob sends the ciphertext. Well, now you have two different instances of the protocol, and you get two different keys. How do you combine the two keys? Multiply them together, or XOR them together, and that gives you. So you get two keys, one from each instance of this protocol. You simply multiply them together. That's that.
Have you proved that step? That concerns me just a little bit.
Yes. You.
Can you repeat the question?
So.
I'm just a little bit concerned. There are lots of protocols
Yes.
you have two separate keys, you XOR and
Bad things happen, but not here.
Or just hash them?
Say that again? Or
just hash them down?
No, you don't even need to hash them down. You can use just the product of the two keys. That's that. It's a very valid concern, but not here. I will try to sort of, as we go through the talk, I'll try to sort of address your question bit by bit.
Okay. I want to make sure we'll stop.
Oh, good. Okay, good. So what's our protocol at the end? Alice sends one message which contains a ciphertext and a projected key, and Bob also sends one message which contains really the same thing. It's a symmetric protocol, and they compute two keys, multiply them together. Done. Okay, so you might wonder if this is really a new idea, right? I mean, did we come up with it, all of our own? It turns out that morally, this idea was already present in some of the previous work, and in particular, the basic idea behind this protocol is already present in a work of Katz, Ostrowski, and Jung, my co-author and others, and Goldrick, Gennaro, and Lindell. And they did this work back in 2000 and 2003, where they came up with a protocol which morally has the same idea. But then why are we doing our work? Doesn't their work already solve this problem? The answer is that their protocol is really the same thing, modulo two problems. And what these two problems do is they force the number of rounds to go from 1, this really nice protocol, to 3 or 5, depending on which setting you're talking about. And what we will do in this work is we will solve these two problems and go back up to this nice little protocol. Okay, so let me tell you what these two problems are, how we solve them, and that should do the trick. Okay, so the first problem is really a very sort of technical problem, which is that which has to do with the way they instantiate this protocol using specific primitives. Okay? In particular, both these works use the Kramer-Shoup CCA encryption scheme as the CC encryption scheme. And when they do that, something bad happens. What happens is that the associated smooth projective hash function they construct has a projection function that depends both on the hash key and the ciphertext. So remember that, ideally the way we defined it, the projection function is supposed to take a key, it's supposed to output a projected key. And this projected key is supposed to work for all possible ciphertexts, assuming that you know the randomness. But here what happens is that the projection function depends on the ciphertext, and the projected key will only work for this particular ciphertext. It won't work for any other ciphertext. Okay? So what happens is that, what does this do to the protocol? Right? What this does to the protocol is that Bob has to wait to receive Alice's ciphertext to compute the projected key, because the projection depends on the ciphertext. Okay, so then, it's not one round anymore, it's kind of 2 rounds. And Alice has to do the same thing. She has to wait to receive Bob's ciphertext before she computes the projection, and that makes the whole protocol already 3 rounds. Right, so that's the first problem that we will try to solve. It's really it's a technical problem, right? I mean, there is nothing bad about the protocol that we constructed in the last slide. It's just the way they instantiated, which gives you this 3 round.
You can't do this in 2 rounds? Like just...
You could. So, yes, you could. But it's 2 simultaneous rounds. So, and this. So that's 4 messages, and so it depends on how you count, right? In any case, the point is that it doesn't satisfy our final goal, which is Diffie-Hellman, like 1 simultaneous round. Good. Okay, so this is the first problem. The second problem has to do with the security of the resulting protocol. And the problem is, what if the man in the middle, the adversary, takes one of these messages, namely the ciphertext that Alice sends, for example, and forwards this to different password sessions. So it can start a whole bunch of different sessions with Bob, and it can sort of take one message of Alice and forward it to different sessions. The requirement, our security requirement, says that the key that Bob computes in all these sessions is independent and uniformly random. And that is something that we need to be concerned about. We need to actually go ahead and prove it. Right? So ideally, what we would like to do is to come up with a mechanism that prevents the adversary from forwarding a message to many different sessions. And that's what these 2 works do. What they do it by appealing to digital signature schemes. So what they do is they ask Alice to come up with the verification key and secret key for a signature scheme. They bind the ciphertext, Alice's ciphertext, to a particular verification key, one that she chooses. So Alice now encrypts the password together with the verification key for a signature scheme, sends it over. Bob does really the same thing. And at the end, Alice sends whatever she's supposed to send before together with the signature of the entire transcript of the protocol. Okay, this is what they do. Why does this work? I claim that this modification really prevents the adversary from taking the first message, forwarding it to many different sessions. Why? He takes the first message. He has 2 options. One, he changes the verification key. Okay, then he's supposed to take this ciphertext, and come up with an encryption of the password together with the new verification key. Now, that is a related ciphertext. It's a ciphertext whose contents are related to the original ciphertext, and therefore he actually succeeded in malling the ciphertext to a related value. But then we used a non-malleable encryption scheme, so he can't do that. Okay? So he cannot change the verification key and still hope to succeed. So he has to keep the verification key the same. But what happens if he keeps the verification key the same? He starts a different session, which has a different transcript, and eventually he's forced to sign a different transcript, a different message for the signature scheme using the same verification key. That can't happen because we use a secure signature scheme. And therefore, bottom line, he cannot reuse the first message that Alice sends. Done. Okay? What is the problem? Even if you solve the first problem, which is this instance-dependent projection, this solution needs 3 rounds. It needs one round where Alice sends a verification key. It needs a different round where she knows the entire transcript and she's able to sign it. You know, that's really bad for us. So we will solve both of these problems, and here's how. The first solution solves the first problem, which is that we will construct an encryption scheme, a chosen ciphertext secure encryption scheme, with a smooth projective hash function, which is not instance dependent. So you can project a key and hope that you can use it for all ciphertexts. And the idea, I'm not going to get into the technical details, but the idea is to use the Elgamal encryption scheme. We like the encryption scheme, it's very simple, so why not let's use it. We'll compile it with the now young paradigm to construct chosen ciphertext secure encryption schemes. So essentially, you know, without getting into details, what happens is that you take 2 instances of, when you want to encrypt a message using this CCA secure encryption scheme, you encrypt the message twice using Elgamal. So one Elgamal encryption, another Elgamal encryption, and you prove in zero knowledge that you encrypted the same message in both cases. So again, without getting into details, what this turns out to do is that you are essentially giving a proof of knowledge of the message when you're sort of constructing the ciphertext. Okay, so you know, and essentially the idea is that if I give you a ciphertext, which is a proof of knowledge of the message, you can't maul it into a different proof of knowledge of the same message. That's why the encryption scheme works in very high level. Okay, details, many details, but you know, it's really the same as Elgamal. Okay, so what you see here is an Elgamal encryption. What you see here is another Elgamal encryption, and you bind them together using a non-interactive zero-knowledge proof, which I'm not going to get into the details. Okay, and you know, this is the encryption scheme. You can construct an associated hash proof system in really the same way that we did before. It's the same principle that we use. Okay, so you know, trust me, this solves the first problem. Again, the important thing to note is that the projection key is something that does not depend on a particular ciphertext. It just takes a hash key and, you know, just computes a projection. That's that. Now, there are technical problems because we are eventually going to work in a bilinear group where Elgamal is not secure anymore. But then we have to move to a slightly more complicated encryption scheme. But again, you know, this is something we can do. Okay, so what this solution did was something amazing. I mean, we had a 3-round protocol, which because of this instance-dependent projection problem, and we now have a 1-round protocol, what we wanted. Except that we still have to solve the problem with security, which is that the adversary can take a ciphertext and forward it to many different sessions. So what? Say that again?
What's SPH?
Smooth projective hash. In the spirit of expanding all. Okay, so how are we going to solve this problem of reusing messages? The COI-GL paradigm, the previous work, what it did was it modified the protocol and added a verification key, asked you to encrypt the verification key together with the password, and so on and so forth to solve this problem. We are not going to do that. We are going to keep the same protocol. You know, we like the protocol, it's 1 round. And we are going to show that this protocol already has the requisite properties, security properties. In particular, we will show the following lemma, which is that, you know, you have, let's say you have n hash keys, a whole bunch of hash keys, k1 up to k sub n, and you have the projections. and you have many ciphertexts, C1 up to C sub m, and you have a matrix of hash evaluations. Namely, you take every possible key, you take every possible ciphertext, put them together. Okay, so that gives you a whole bunch of hash evaluations. And we want to show that this whole thing looks like uniformly random to me. The key thing to note is that the key non-trivial thing here is that each ciphertext is reused many different times. I'm going to use each ciphertext with all possible hash keys. And I'm going to use each hash key with all possible ciphertexts. This is really the maximal reuse that you can expect. And what this lemma says is that that's okay. The resulting hash values will look totally independent and random. Okay, so let me sort of skip the details. Let me just leave you with the statement of this claim. Essentially what this does is it shows that even if the adversary can take a ciphertext, forward it to many different sessions, the resulting key will look random. All the different keys will look uniformly random and independent. Okay, so what is the effect? The effect is that the nice protocol that we started off with actually does work. Okay, and this gives you the final. So this is the final protocol that we have. Okay, so you need to add the identities of the parties just to prevent kind of replay attacks, but those are details. So one thing that you might wonder is, when we constructed the encryption scheme, we took Elgamal, which is really efficient, and compiled it with a non-interactive zero-knowledge proof system, which is extremely, extremely inefficient. So what's going on here, right? The answer is that for the particular encryption scheme that we use, you really have very efficient zero-knowledge proof systems. And this is from a work of Groth and Sahai, based on an earlier work of Groth, Ostrovsky, and Sahai. Okay, so this is, you hear non-interactive zero-knowledge, you think, this is really inefficient, but that's not really the case because we use a particular instantiation here. Okay, so that's the basic protocol. This doesn't satisfy composable security. Namely, if you run many different instances in all kinds of weird combinations, it's not guaranteed to be secure. But we can actually get even the stronger notion of security by adding just one message. Okay, so this is actually a simultaneous message because I can send all these three things in one round. Okay, so it doesn't increase the round complexity. Okay, so that's that. I think I'm almost out of time. So what we showed is a password-based key exchange protocol at essentially, asymptotically the same cost as Diffie-Hellman. There is still the question of optimizing all these building blocks and coming up with a small enough constant. I think this is really a an important problem in practice. A number of other open questions. Efficient such protocol in the plain model without assuming the common random string, which is really a theoretical question. Security against adaptive corruptions and so on and so forth. Okay, so the second question is, we started off by saying Alice and Bob, to solve the authenticated key exchange problem, Alice and Bob need to have some shared information. But what if they don't, right? Somehow Alice and Bob have never met before, and they still want to do some meaningful notion of key exchange. Of course, in this setting, you can always carry out the impersonation attack. The adversary can sit in the middle, pretend to Alice as if he's Bob, and pretend to Bob as if he's Alice. But can you say anything meaningful? Can you achieve any meaningful security guarantee in this setting?
They have to have shared information. They have shared private information.
They need to have like a PKI, like a PKI.
Yeah.
I'm asking really, you don't have a PKI, you don't have shared keys, you have nothing.
So
you're an alien, right? And
So no shared public information.
No, none at all. No validated, shared public information. clearly you cannot achieve authenticated key exchange, but can you say something non-trivial? And in fact, there is a recent work of Charlie Rakoff and students who show something in this setting. It's hard to understand what this something is, but it's an interesting sort of fundamental question to ask.
It's almost a philosophical question. How do I know you're a Vinod and not Joe the plumber? Right?
You don't.
Right, so I think I'm talking to Vinod. I'm really talking to Joe the plumber, according to the Vinod.
Yes, that is the impersonation.
No escape from that, right?
No, that is the impersonation attack. I mean, there is no escape from that. But
what establishes your identity? I haven't checked your birth certificate.
Sure.
As you know, it doesn't do any good if you ask Obama.
I completely agree. But what can you? But is all hope lost in this setting? Can you say something non-trivial? That's my question. Okay. The final question is: well, we've been studying key exchange in the context of computational assumptions. Can you minimize the computational assumptions needed to achieve key exchange? But can we make physical assumptions? Are there physical settings in which you can actually do key exchange, authenticated key exchange in an easier way? For example, Wiener had a model of wiretap channels back in the 50s or 60s, something like that. And that, it turns out in that model you can actually do key exchange in a very simple way. Even in an information theoretically secure way. And what the wiretap channel says is roughly that the adversary can't perfectly eavesdrop on the communication channel. It can only get each bit with a certain probability.
I thought even a perfect eavesdropper cannot break Diffie-Hellman.
It is not information theoretically secure. So if you solve the discrete log problem, of course you can break the Diffie-Hellman protocol. But with this physical assumption, you can get an information theoretically secure protocol. What about other settings? Right? It's a wide open question. That's that. I assume there are no more questions, but so Josh, you can take it offline.
Okay.